That Friday began like any other, with Lucia adjusting her ponytail in front of the cracked mirror in the dressing room and slipping her subway card back into her apron pocket. Cipriani already had that air of an expensive night. Glasses lined up, tablecloths taut, a symphony of silverware that no one sees but everyone hears. She knew the rhythm like someone knows their own breath. Short steps, straight back, a smile that doesn't intrude, steady hands handling the glassware that costs more than the rent. Outside, New York seemed like a promise. Inside, it was the job that paid for painkillers, late taxis, and lately, chemotherapy prescriptions for Julia. When they announced Table 17 VIP, she didn't think anything special. She set the wine to the exact temperature, mentally reviewed the server's allergies and preferences. The man arrived quietly, in an austere suit, with a tired look, and that way of carrying himself as if he were carrying the weight of the world. Lucia extended her wrist to rest the bottle on her finger, and then she saw it, a red rose entwined around the infinity symbol, tattooed on the same spot on her pulse, where, since childhood, she had seen that design on her mother. It wasn't a romantic premonition or a cinematic epiphany. It was a sharp jolt in her stomach, the precise sensation that something that had never quite fit had finally found its place. Her hand trembled enough that the rim of the glass vibrated. The man looked at her for a second, and in that second, before the ink disappeared back under his shirt cuff, she already knew that her night had shifted. The rest unfolded in the hushed silence of an expensive restaurant, the soft clinking of the glass as it touched the plate, the maitre d's shadow taking a step closer, the lemon scent of freshly washed hands. Lucia said nothing theatrical. She simply set the pace, removing invisible crumbs, returning to the station to take 2 deep breaths through her nose, counting to 10 as she had learned during long shifts. She returned to the table with the bottle, and the man, who until then had seemed oblivious to the room, turned his wrist to check his watch. The ink reappeared, identical to Julia's, the same burnt red, the same firm stroke. He couldn't measure the seconds between that gesture and the next. A short question, just his mother's name spoken carefully, and the glint of wine on the tablecloth when the glass failed to find the table. There were no shouts, only an abrupt retreat, a check that someone else signed, and the dense murmur from the kitchen as she stepped through the curtain. As she finished her shift, the early morning chill hit her face, as if trying to rouse her from a dream that wasn't really a dream. In the nearly empty train car, she clutched her phone to her palm and stared at her own bare wrist. She had no answers that sounded right, only a gnawing intuition that insisted this night couldn't be filed away as a ward incident. As she climbed the stairs of her building, the smell of noodle soup, her mother's short footsteps in the kitchen, everything familiar was waiting for her, except for the feeling that, upon opening the door, her life would be divided into before and after. Julia wasn't surprised to see her come in so late. The clock was almost 2, and the television was playing a documentary that no one was watching. Lucia put her bag on the floor and stood still for a moment, watching her mother's fragile pulse hover over the teacup. It was the same place as always, but that night the air felt heavier. She asked about the rose tattoo in a voice that didn't sound like her own, half trembling, half urgent. Julia lowered her eyes, traced the design with her fingers, and after a silence that seemed like an eternity, began to speak. The story didn't come out in an orderly fashion. It came out like tears, unbidden. Names, streets, dates intersecting with memories. Adrian, Germany, letters that never arrived, a promise that time swallowed. Lucia didn't know whether to feel betrayed, moved, or simply tired. But one thing was certain. Everything she knew about her life had just been shaken. She slept little. She dreamed of trains leaving without a destination and of a rose bleeding ink onto her wrist. At dawn, she made coffee, left her medications on the nightstand, and headed to the hospital with the feeling that she had been walking for ages. Confirmation came quickly. Adrian Keller existed. He was breathing, and he lived just a few blocks from the restaurant. On the way, images from the previous shift hit her in waves: the spilled wine, his vacant stare, the absurd coincidence of the tattoo. When she entered Memorial Hospital, the smell of disinfectant made her stomach churn. She thought about what Julia had said, that she had loved a man who never knew he had a daughter. And now, decades later, the three of them were alive in the same city, sharing a piece of destiny that no one had asked for. The next day was a mix of routine and vertigo. Lucia tried to work as if nothing was wrong, but each tray she lifted felt twice as heavy. During her break, she checked her phone 1,000 times, looking for any sign, a message, anything. Nothing. When she got home, Julia was lying down, breathing heavily, and on the table was an old folder with yellowed photographs. In one of them, Adrian and Julia smiled in front of a rain-streaked window. Young, so different from the present that it hurt to look at. Them. Lucia felt a lump in her throat. It was like seeing a parallel life that never existed. That night, she decided she couldn't just sit around waiting for the past to explain itself. With the address she found in the folder, she stood in front of a glass and steel building in the heart of Manhattan. She had no appointment, no plan, only the need to understand. At the reception desk of Keller Tech's corporate headquarters, the security guard gave her that "this isn't for you" look. But she persisted. She left her name and phone number and walked away without looking back. She wasn't expecting a reply. However, that same afternoon, on her way home from the hospital, an unknown number appeared on her screen. "This is Thomas Beck, Mr. Keller's lawyer. He wants to see you tomorrow." Lucia's heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. She didn't know if she was about to close a wound or open a much deeper one. The meeting took place in a conference room far too large for two people. Adrian arrived punctually, exuding an air of both power and bewilderment. There were no hugs or theatrics, only a palpable discomfort. Lucia spoke first, recounting everything she knew, without embellishment, without pausing. He listened in silence, his gaze fixed on the table, until the words "my mother is dying" shattered his composure. His breath quickened, as if each sentence were tearing a crack in the ground he had built over decades. When Lucia finished, Adrian lifted his shirt sleeve and looked at the tattoo. 25 years ago, I thought life had erased it, he murmured, almost to himself. In that instant, they both understood that the story could no longer remain hidden. As she left the building, Lucia leaned against a column and took a deep breath. The cool evening air hit her, but it didn't manage to dampen the mixture of relief and fear she felt. She looked at her phone, unsure who to call. There was no one who could understand what had just happened. She wandered aimlessly through the illuminated streets, with the feeling that the entire city was watching her for the first time. In a corner of her mind, she thought of all the people who, like her, carried invisible truths, until one day they exploded without warning. If anyone reading this story has made it this far, tell us where you're reading from and leave a like. Perhaps someone else needs to know they're not alone. That night, Lucia returned to her apartment with a heavier heart. But with one small certainty: the truth, however painful, always had the power to begin something new. Julia waited awake, a blanket draped over her shoulders, her eyes red and swollen. When Lucia told her she'd seen Adrian, there was no surprise, only silent tears that flowed freely. She begged her to bring him to the hospital, saying she needed to see him before her body gave out completely. That morning, mother and daughter lay embraced, remembering things they'd never shared. Lucia's childhood, their years in Italy, the silences imposed by work. Julia had no strength for speeches. She only repeated that love isn't measured by time, but by the truth it leaves behind. Lucia listened, her head resting on her chest, just as she had when she was a child, knowing that every word could be her last. Adrian arrived the next day, a flower in his hand, his face etched with the aging of someone who had aged suddenly. The hospital corridor was silent as he entered the room. Julia gazed at him with a mixture of wonder and tenderness. Time had erased their youthful faces, but not their recognition. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Lucia stood to one side, feeling as though she were witnessing something from another century. Then Julia took his hand and smiled faintly. "I looked for you," Adrian managed to say. And in that sentence were summed up 25 years of distance, lost letters, and opportunities crushed by fate. There were no recriminations, only a profound sense of relief, as if all that pain finally made sense. That afternoon, the hospital became an unexpected refuge. The three of them spent hours together, talking between pauses, letting the silence speak what words could not. Adrian recounted how he had become who he was, the effort, the years of solitude, the emptiness he could never fill. Julia listened without resentment, caressing his tattoo with her slender fingers, as if tracing the outline of a story that was not yet finished. Lucia watched in silence, with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. For the first time, she understood that her mother had never been alone. She had simply learned to live without answers. The following days were a kind of respite. Adrian visited Julia every morning before going to work, bringing flowers and reading by her bedside. Lucia watched as her mother, despite her exhaustion, regained a light she hadn't shown in a long time. The nurses noticed the change, and even the doctors spoke of a slight but steady improvement. It was then that Adrian decided to take her to Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, convinced that she would have a real chance there. Lucia hesitated. She didn't want false hope, but Julia's gaze, that gaze of someone who had already made peace with life, convinced her that they should try. The transfer was quick and discreet. Adrian took care of everything. A private ambulance, a private room, a full medical team. Lucia watched with a mixture of admiration and distrust. She wasn't used to someone else handling things for her. At the new hospital, Julia seemed calmer. She spent her days gazing out the window at the grey New York sky, while Adrian stayed by her side, reading her excerpts from an old book of Italian poetry. Lucia watched them and felt that life was granting them a small reprieve against time. Amidst the exhaustion and the visitors, something inside her was beginning to heal as well. One morning, Adrian called her into the hallway. His voice cracked. He wanted to officially confirm what everyone already knew. He had sent a DNA sample to compare with Lucia's. The result arrived 2 days later with a percentage that seemed to scream from the page, 99.9%. Lucia stared at that number as if it didn't belong in her world. Suddenly, the man she saw in magazines, in financial news reports, was her father. She didn't know what to feel: gratitude, anger, or simply disbelief. Julia wept silently upon hearing the news, while Adrian embraced her with a tenderness that mingled guilt and relief. It was the beginning of something new, uncertain, but profoundly human. The days at Memorial became a routine of hope. Julia was responding better to the new experimental treatment, and although the doctors were cautious, Lucia was beginning to believe that a miracle wasn't impossible. Adrian took care of everything. He spoke with the specialists, signed the papers, covered expenses they couldn't have dreamed of paying. Sometimes Lucia would watch him in silence, trying to reconcile the image of the cold businessman from the magazines with the man who now held her mother's hand every night. In that contrast, she found a humanity she hadn't expected, a quiet redemption that touched her as well. As the weeks passed, the room filled with small symbols of life, fresh flowers, open books, an old radio playing softly. Julia, fragile but aware, began to smile again. One day, while Adrian recited verses by Pavese to her, she took his hand and whispered something. Lucia barely heard. "I'm not leaving yet." It was the first time her voice sounded like a promise and not a farewell. Outside, winter was fading, and inside that room, everything seemed to be starting anew, even though no one said it aloud. Adrian began visiting them even on weekends, bringing homemade food and an energy that transformed the atmosphere. At first, Lucia kept her distance, trying to understand her place in this new situation. But little by little, the barriers began to crumble. She would accompany him to the hospital cafeteria, and they would talk about trivial things: coffee, the weather, the books she wanted to read. Sometimes, without realizing it, they would find themselves laughing. It was a strange closeness, built amidst IV drips and the smell of disinfectant, but genuine. Lucia began to see in him not only the father life had denied her, but also a man trying to make amends for his own past. Julia, aware of how little time she had left, began to tell them what she wished for them. She said her greatest comfort was knowing they had found each other before she left. She asked Adrian to take care of Lucia, not as a duty, but as an opportunity. And she asked her daughter for something more difficult, not to hold a grudge. Those words lingered in the room long after Julia fell asleep. That night, Lucia understood that her mother's love was, above all, a lesson in forgiveness. It wasn't about erasing the pain, but about learning to live with it, without letting it consume her. The day Adrian proposed to Julia, there were no rings or kneeling. It was a simple conversation, brimming with truth. The three of them were in the room, the television on but muted, when he took her hand and told her he wanted to close the circle, to give her his last name, even though time no longer belonged to them. Julia looked at him with teary eyes and nodded. Lucia felt she was witnessing something sacred, not a youthful love, but a mature, adult decision made with tenderness, not illusion. In that union, silent and unadorned, there was a beauty that no amount of wealth could match. The ceremony was small, impromptu, with nurses carrying flowers and doctors lingering to witness it. Julia wore a white coat, Adrian a grey suit, and Lucia held a bouquet of red roses. When they said, "I do," the applause was subdued, as if the entire hospital were holding its breath. If reading this made you feel something similar to what they experienced, please share this story. Sometimes a story like this can touch more lives than we imagine. That afternoon, Lucia watched them sign the marriage certificate with trembling hands and thought that life, in its own way, always finds a way to mend what time has broken. After the ceremony, the hospital seemed transformed. Nurses strolled by smiling, patients from other wards sent flowers, and even doctors stopped to say hello. Julia, though frail, radiated a calmness Lucia hadn't seen in her for years. Adrian stayed by her side, holding her hand, telling her about the places they would visit when she left. The Connecticut coast, a rose garden he'd seen on a trip long ago, a house overlooking the sea. Lucia listened from a corner, and for the first time she felt not sadness, but immense gratitude for having witnessed something so rare and pure. The following months brought an unexpected remission. Julia began walking the halls, eating better, and laughing with the nurses. Adrian discreetly arranged a move to a small house by the sea so she could breathe fresh air and rest. When they finally settled in Connecticut, Lucia felt they were experiencing a daily miracle. Simple breakfasts, afternoons spent reading, conversations about nothing and everything. The sound of the sea accompanied each day, reminding them that life isn't measured by the number of years, but by the moments when one can breathe without fear. In Connecticut, time began to slow down. The mornings smelled of freshly brewed coffee and salt. The nights were long and peaceful, with the murmur of the sea lapping against the rocks. Julia would spend hours gazing at the horizon, her head resting on Adrian's shoulder, and Lucia would watch her from the kitchen, memorizing every gesture, every smile. There were no speeches or promises, only presence. It was as if they had all learned, through hardship, that life isn't measured in future plans, but in the moments one truly feels. One summer day, Lucia graduated. Adrian and Julia were there, sitting together in the front row, holding hands. When Lucia's name echoed through the auditorium, the three of them exchanged a silent glance, knowing that this moment marked the end of a chapter that had begun quietly, amidst glasses of wine and old scars. Afterward, they celebrated at home with a simple cake and soft music. Julia, thinner but with eyes full of light, raised her mug and said, "Life always finds a way to return." No one replied. There was no need. The sea outside was already saying it all. Autumn arrived with a different feel. Julia was still fragile but stable, and hospital visits became less frequent. Adrian worked from home, and Lucia began volunteering with a foundation that helped children of cancer patients. She had found a purpose, a way to transform her story into something worthwhile. Every night, the three of them ate dinner together overlooking the sea, talking about simple things, recipes, movies, memories. There was laughter, comfortable, silences, and a sense of peace that no one dared name. For the first time, the word family didn't hurt. One afternoon, Julia called Lucia to the porch. Her face was serene, but her eyes held a gleam that Julia knew all too well. She asked her to sit beside her and, in a barely audible voice, told her that she wasn't afraid, that she felt whole. "Now I can leave in peace," she murmured. Lucia hugged her tightly without tears, certain that this moment was a gift. Adrian watched from the doorway, motionless, understanding without needing words. That night, the sea roared louder than ever, as if nature wanted to etch Julia's final lesson into both their memories. Love, even when it hurts, always leaves something alive behind. Julia left in the quiet of a November morning, the sea calm, Adrian's hand in hers. Lucia was there holding a lit candle, unable to cry at first. The pain was so profound it seemed too deep to contain, but amidst the sadness there was also gratitude. Julia didn't leave alone. She left loved, reconciled with her past, leaving behind a peace that filled the entire house. On the bedroom wall hung the photographs of the three of them, and next to the frame, a note in her delicate handwriting, "Do not seek me in time, but in what remains." Years passed, and although the emptiness never completely disappeared, Lucia learned to live with it. She continued living in the house on the coast, where the air smelled of roses and salt. Adrian aged with dignity, dedicating his days to charitable projects in Julia's name. Sometimes in the afternoons, he and Lucia would walk along the beach, saying little, simply gazing at the horizon, where the sun slowly sank. On their wrists, the two roses intertwined with the infinity symbol remained, faded yet steadfast, reminding them that love, even when it dies in the body, leaves roots in memory. It was the end of one story, yes, but also the beginning of another kind of eternity.